Hey, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Beekeeping for Newbies. Thank you so very much for taking the time to listen. I do appreciate you. And as always, feel free to reach out, Jeff at beekeepingfornewbies.com. Got to send my special thanks out to the patron team. So thank you to Mary, Adam, Candace, David, Michael, and Susie. Couldn't do it without you guys. I appreciate all your contributions. Okay, so this is going to be the part 2 episode with Charlotte Wiggins, the interview that we did last week. So we ended up going over about 2 hours and 15 minutes. I tried to divide it up as close to in half as I could. It's a little bit of an abrupt kind of transition there, so I do apologize for that. But we basically left off. We were just starting to talk about overwintering and some strategies, and we just kind of rolled right into it. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into that right now, that portion of the discussion, and I hope you enjoy. Definitely great info. Well, on that subject of kind of overwintering, it really leads well into the next question. So someone had posted this morning and said on the topic of overwintering, and it's got kind of 5 or 6 things here. I think we just kind of covered one of them, but I'll run through real quick and see if we can get your take on these. So how do you, like in your area, how do you overwinter? Do you insulate? Do you wrap? Do you do quilt boxes, or one? I think you mentioned that you would either do like a single deep or a couple mediums, but they were asking like how many boxes do you typically use? Do you put sugar inside? And then the last question was how cold does it typically get there, which of course is a moving target and a bit of a variable thing. But so just as a quick recap, is there insulation, wrapping, how many boxes, sugar, and quilt box?
So, I've been doing this for 15 years. When I started, our temperatures here were colder than they are today. There's a gradual warming in this area. I was in USDA hardiness zone 5B. They're now saying 6A. That means that they've taken an average of the temperatures over the last 13 years, and they tell you how low the temperature will go on the average. The problem with that is it's on the average, right? Some years you might have a much colder winter, and some years you might have a warmer winter. But the trend is definitely warming up. So we don't have as long of a winter as we used to have. We have longer springs and falls and shorter winters and summers. Having said that, our winter, the last 3 years, has basically spanned from about November to February, maybe March. That's probably a month less than it used to be. Our first hard frost here is usually Halloween, end of October, and then you would go into winter through March. Well, it's being warmer now in November, and temperatures have been warming up in March. So in general, people around here will use a deep or 2 mediums as the brood box, and then 1 to 2 supers on top. I've had people tell me that they've also wintered over with just a deep, which seems a little stressful for the bees. And stressful for the bees. But I've heard people, if it's a small enough colony, maybe they can pull that off. In terms of how to prepare for bees, I have for years wrapped my hives with it's a quilted plastic. I got it from Minnesota because I'm on the side of a hill. I have a 45-degree angle facing west. And so for me, it's more of a windbreak for my hives than anything. I have put old Christmas trees in front of them just to give them a little bit of a protection from the winds. But for the most part, they have some of them had screen bottom boards, some of them solid bottom boards. That doesn't seem to make a difference in their survival. I do make sure that the entrance reducers are down to the smallest size, and I do check to make sure there are no mice in there before I turn it to the smallest size. My last inspection of the season. And there's been some discussion recently. My friend David, who's been keeping bees as long as I have, he's my bee buddy, he's been using 1/2 inch to 1 inch insulation. You can get them at a home and garden center. I think they look blue. He's been cutting those out and using them as an inner cover. He also puts a hole like you would have in an inner cover. And he thinks that has helped his bees wintering over. Now, he lives in a other side of town, different growing environment than I do, but he still worries about the wind as well on his place. So I'm going to try that this year. But for the most part, my bees have wintered over well on their own with just the wrap. And a couple of winters, I didn't put anything around them, and they did okay.
So what your friend mentioned sounds very similar. I think it was David just said is very similar to what I've done for probably 8 or 9 years. It is my favorite thing to put into the hive, and I use it year round, but it's basically about a 3-inch top piece, and it's got vents all the way around with just some number 8 hardware cloth. And in the summertime, I just leave it like it is. It's completely closed, so the bees can come all the way up to it and use it as a little bit of a top entrance if they want.
Nice.
Yeah, at sometimes a year, I go ahead and put some hardware cloth over it because I don't want robbers and I don't want them to have to defend that other area. Now, in the wintertime, because there is a hole in the middle of it that I just have covered with hardware cloth. It's probably about maybe 3 inches wide by 4 inches long, kind of like an oval. In the wintertime, I put a 2.5 or 2 inch piece of that foam insulation in there. And then, so as that, that heat and that damp air is rising up, it kind of gets absorbed into that, so it's not dripping down on them. But yet it helps to keep things nice and warm. And in the summertime, it provides great ventilation going up.
Oh, I love that.
Oh, I'm a huge fan. And I've been using these now for about 8 or 9 years, and I've had no, I think any failures I've had have been completely unrelated to anything with moisture dripping or, the ventilation.
Right.
It's my favorite thing. So I will send you a link to that because those are great.
I would love to see that. Well, and if for the beginning beekeepers, you can make a screened inner cover, right? It's like a little picture frame that goes on top of your, whatever your hive body size is. And then you stretch number 8 hardware cloth across, you cut it to size, you staple it in. And instead of having that hard inner cover, you have a screened inner cover. So when you're looking at your bees, they don't fly up at you, right? And you can check, and that also helps with ventilation.
Great idea.
I must have made those, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And it's probably the best thing I ever did as a beginning beekeeper. We had 115 degrees here last summer.
Oh, geez.
And bees die at that temperature. And we have, how many? 8 colonies that are teaching apiary. And David and I looked at the temperature and we jumped in our cars and drove out there, and the bees were all on the bottom. They weren't hanging on the frames. It was so hot inside those hives. So we ripped off any inner cover that was solid. We took the metal covers off. We had some migrating wooden covers that we slapped on there instead of the pretty metal one.
Sure, yeah.
We made sure the entrance reducers were all open. We put a little piece of wood under the cover to help them create that chimney effect of air through. We saw some bees at the front trying to push air with their little wings, but we went ahead and added that little stick on the back so that helped them. The ones that had the feeding shims have a hole in the front, just like they have an entrance at the top. But the feeding shims can also act like a ventilated inner cover if you don't have them. And when we went back, we checked 6 of them. When we went back to check the first one after we'd done all this, they were back up on their frames. They were able to go back to do their bee thing because it just wasn't so hot.
Wow,
so anything you can do with temperature regulation is a good idea.
Yep. And that's part of the discussion we have around, I think that people will ask questions about that. Hey, I'm seeing a lot of bearding. I'm seeing a lot of bees that are outside, not inside. Is this a concern? And that's where I kind of tell people, hey, it's going to happen. It's going to get hot enough. It's going to happen. But the thing about it is doing everything you can, like you just pointed out, to make sure there's as much airflow as possible. And hopefully those really, really hot days, because that's the worst thing in the world, having a colony abscond because it's hot, and then they go somewhere where they can't even establish themselves and survive the winter. So, yeah, that's devastating. The next thing that I have on the list here is swarm catching, and I know you and I had a chance to kind of chat briefly about this earlier. On the the technical level, I think it's like you got your swarm traps, and you have things you do around. What do you call it? More of like passive, swarm catching. And then you have the scenario like I had with my next door neighbor where my hives aren't even at my house. I just happened to walk past the window and literally saw a swarm moving its way across my neighbor's yard. And I texted them and said, hey, there's a swarm. Do you mind if I grab it? And they said, yeah, go ahead. So that's more of like your active swarm catching. But I think that, you had brought up a comment yesterday that I'd love for you to kind of elaborate and share more thoughts on, but you said, they're not just free bees, right? And, so
Right.
anything you have around, swarms and swarm catching, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, first, swarm catching is great bragging rights, okay? I mean, if you've caught a swarm, you have a story to share, right? At any kind of event, over coffee, there are some fabulous swarm catching stories. One of my funniest ones was when I first started, a gentleman who was much more experienced had a bunch of empty boxes in the back of his truck, and he was going fishing. And he's driving down the road, and people start flagging him down. There was a swarm chasing the empty, hive in the back of his truck. So, I mean, there's a ton of great swarm stories. But when especially if you're beginning, you like to think of, and people will tell you, oh, don't go buy bees, go catch a swarm. Well, swarms are not free bees. First, they do travel with small hive beetles and varroa, so you're not pest-free. Secondly, the first swarm, right, the primary swarm, is a older queen leaving with a third of a colony, and she's leaving her daughter behind. But she may or may not have enough sperm still saved in her spermatheca to continue the colony. So unless you know what to look for, she might be laying for the first couple weeks or first couple months, and then all of a sudden she stops laying. Now, if the bees are strong enough, they might be able to build, right, have a supersedure cell that they develop. But if you're a new beekeeper, you may not know what to look for. Sometimes they don't build a supersedure cell, and then you have issues with your colony. So how much does it cost to buy yourself a mated queen these days? $50. If you're buying a virgin queen, it's $25 plus shipping. So unless you have a local source for those queens, and that tends to be June, July around here when they've caught the swarms and they've settled in for a while. And then all of a sudden they go out there and they don't see any eggs and they don't see any brood. When you need a queen, you don't always have access to one. The other thing with swarms is you don't know the genetics. You don't know what you're inheriting or what you're bringing into your apiary. And there are different breeds of bees, right? You've got the Carnolians, you've got the Russians, you've got the Italians. And even though they're kind of mutt bees, they have different times of the year when they brood, right? When they build babies. If you don't know that, you might be looking at the swarm and going, oh, they're not doing well. I've got to requeen. When they're doing perfectly fine for what their species or their breed is, but you don't know what that is. So the more experience you have, the better you off in managing swarms. The statistics on swarms are interesting. Half of them don't make it through their first winter. 60% don't make it through their second winter. And it's interesting. I'm not quite sure what all contributes to those numbers, except that people have a tendency to think that swarms can take care of themselves. And that's not true. You do want them to take care of themselves, but you need to spend a little more time making sure that they're healthy. I've had people collect swarms and never feed them. Well, depending on what time of year you get them, if they're in the spring, yes, you cannot feed them because hopefully they will have a queen laying and she'll have young bees that are ones that produce the wax. But if you're catching a swarm in summer or early fall, those bees are older. They may or may not be able to produce wax. And so you may have a swarm that's in a new box with frames without wax on it, and they're not doing anything because they've outgrown their ability to produce wax. So not that you can't do something about it, you can put frames with wax in there, but you need to have some bees, right, that you can borrow from to do that. And you need to have some experience to recognize that your bees need that kind of help at that time of year. We had a lady last year that got a swarm in September, and she fed them all through winter successfully. And around here, we don't let you call yourselves a beekeeper until you've pulled a colony through winter together, at least once. And then you get a little pin. We have a little pinning ceremony in March, and we say, oh, you get to call yourself a beekeeper now. Nice. And that encourages people to understand that you're not a beekeeper just by having bees. You actually have to work with your bees successfully. And I asked her what she was sugar water, just one-on-one sugar water without anything in it. And I said, okay, well, coming into spring, though, encourage them to go get the nectar in nature because that will be healthier for them than the sugar water. And she lost them in the summer. And I would contend to you, she lost them because they were not getting the right nutrition that they needed.
Interesting.
She did everything she could to keep that colony going. She kept asking us, how can you guarantee that I'll keep the colony alive? I said, I can't. You're doing everything that I know to do, but it's going to be up to the genetics of the bees and what kind of food they can get into. On the other side, there are other people who very successfully done the same thing. So there's no guarantee, right? If you're depending on catching swarms to set up a beekeeping business, for example, that's not a good strategy because it may take more work and you can't depend on the bees surviving. If you start out with nukes and packages, your odds are higher for success. And you're definitely not free, right? You're going to be spending money on the sugar to feed them, buying queens, maybe borrowing a frame of brood from somebody else to keep that swarm going, right, until the queen lays. So there's some expenses that are associated with that.
So I think you just shattered the dreams of a few listeners here. I know we got a lot of swarm trappers out there.
Well, and we have a group of people who go swarm catching just for the fun of it. They don't want to keep the bees. They just want to go, for the bragging rights. And we encourage that because they learn something about the bees doing that. What I don't want is to put freebies that are the best bees to get for beginners. They're not. They are a little bit more work. Doesn't mean you can't be successful, but you need to have a little more experience with the bees to recognize the trouble signs, right, that you might see with the swarm.
All great points. That's it's definitely some considerations there to keep in mind. Now I have a couple more here. So we've got I think the next two actually kind of tie in together. One of them is a lot of times bees will have challenges recognizing space, left and right or above them, and someone will say, well, when do I need to add a super or when should I add a second deep? And I've said, well, generically speaking, in the springtime, things are happening really, really fast. I would rather you act a little early than to act too late. You do still need to be mindful of the fact that, you can have colder nights that just pop in and be unseasonably cold and they've still got to stay warm. So, I say in that like 60, 70% range of capacity, that's where you probably need to look at expanding. But how many times have we gone in and seen, 3 frames to the left, 2 frames to the right, and queen cells in the middle? And they're going, well, they had plenty of room. So I'd be curious on your thoughts on, any recommendations around, because what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll go right into the middle of the brood chamber, slide everything left and right, pull a frame from the outside, drop, wax foundation in the middle, and then it just forces them to draw it up. And that works pretty well. But as far as if you had any thoughts or suggestions, and then on top of that, like when do you recommend supering? Like when do you have any kind of indicators where you say, whenever I see this, that's where I make the call?
So when I'm starting, and so you're trying to get the bees to pull wax on unwaxed frames. And so you're starting to build up that colony, right? So you've got your bottom, whatever the brood box is. As you see the bees expanding, when you see them working the 2 outside frames, and this applies to either an 8-frame or a 10-frame box, that honey frame, right? So the order of the frames that the order that the bees work the frames is they have the 2 outside frames are honey. The next 2 frames, so let's say 1 and 8 are honey, 2 and 7 are bee bread, right? That's their larder. That's where they're putting the food for the nurse bees to produce the royal jelly on their hyphalangeal glands. And then the 3 to 6, those 3 to 6 frames are the nursery, right? That's the brood chamber. So when you start seeing in your first box that they're working the frames 1 and 10, that's when you add a super, right? If it's a medium super, or if you've got a deep super, you can add a medium. Some people like to add a second deep on there. I prefer to do a deep and then start adding mediums. That second medium if it's done correctly, should be also a brood chamber, right? Brood space. If you want to harvest honey, you don't want them mixing the nectar that they're storing with the brood chamber. So if you're thinking you want to have one super of honey, remember you're not feeding them sugar water, because if you're feeding them sugar water, you don't collect that. That's not honey. That's just stored sugar water. You would put your queen excluder under that second super for 2 weeks until they build the honey band over the top of those frames, right on the bottom. Make sure all of the frames have the honey band. The queen normally doesn't cross the honey band. She stays below that. So that means she would not be climbing into that second super, right, medium super, and laying there. I don't use queen excluders for that. I don't care. I'm not, if she gets into that second super, that tells me she ran out of room down in the bottom. And I just leave those frames then for the bees in the wintertime, right? Once they close, once they hatch, the honey's there and they can have that for winter food. And then as you see them filling out again, the outside 2 frames of that medium super, now you get to have fun with it. And that's what's called checkerboarding. You want them to go up to the second medium, right? So they've got the first medium. Maybe they have some brood in there. They have a little bit of honey as well. Now you want your second super to have just honey in it. So you're going to pull a couple of the frames that are in that first medium super that have bees on them, and you're going to put them up in your second box. And you're going to put new frames in the bottom, and you're going to put them so that there's every other frame. One is a pull frame of maybe they put some nectar in a frame, an empty frame that they need to pull the wax out, and then another frame that has bees on, whatever they're working on, and an empty frame. That's called checkerboarding your honey super. You do not checkerboard your brood chamber. You want to keep your brood chamber together, because the bees have set that up. They know, remember, the nurse bees are brand new. They're taking care of those babies, and so they know what their little jobs are as beginning bees. As soon as you start messing with the order in the brood chamber, you can cause issues with the nurse bees that are supposed to be taking care of those bees. Now, Jeff, you mentioned that sometimes you drop a frame in the middle of the brood chamber. You can do that. In most cases, though, you need to be checking those frames in the brood chamber first. And what I've noticed around here is people will pull a frame out and they'll go, "Oh, she has room." Well, turn around and have the sun over your shoulder and then look at your frame. In most cases, you will see that when the foragers are working faster than the queen is laying eggs, they have nectar in that circle that's in the middle of the brood frame. And they're storing, because you haven't added supers, right? You haven't given them that second or that third super. So they put that wherever they can. And you'll see the little shiny nectar coming through. If you're doing it without the sun shining over your shoulder, it will look like it's empty.
That's a really great point.
Okay? So you need to make sure you're looking. You can also take a flashlight, a flashlight as well. But you need to make sure the queen really has room to lay. And if she does, that's great. Sometimes it can look spotty because they're little bees, eclosing. They look like little Star Wars creatures. They're running around. They're blonde and they're fuzzy and they're just wonderful to watch. But the critical part is that queen has to have her room. The other thing I see that happens, too, is sometimes we'll put frames in there, and for whatever reason, they don't like the frame. It can be it didn't have enough wax at the factory. I tend to wax all my frames now before I put them in. It's better to have too much wax on them than not enough. Sometimes they don't like the black frames. We put black frames in the brood box so you can see the eggs better. Some of my bees like those black frames. Some of them don't. But if you don't see bees on a frame, take a good close look at the frame. Now, you may say, well, they've got room. Well, no, according to the bees, they don't like that frame, so they don't have room. That doesn't count as space to them. So you need to replace that frame. and give them another one and see if they'll work the other one.
That's, and one thing I've said along those lines before is if you had a black one on one side, on the opposite side where they haven't expanded yet, either go with some traditional wax foundation or try the yellow, something like that. So at least it gives them an option. You can compare live,
Yeah. And the other thing is too, when you're working those opposite frames, right, the 1 and 8, if you see them that they pull the wax off on one side, but they're not working the other side yet, you can pull that frame up and turn it around and face the side of the frame that they're not working to the inside, which will encourage them to pull the wax off on that frame.
Good idea.
Eventually, they may do that, but and that gives them. So as far as the bees are concerned, they have new space. They don't, for some reason, they don't seem to count that space if it's facing the hive wall. But if you put it on the inside, it's like, oh, we just got some new room here. So that buys you a little time. If you're out of frames, you've got to order some, all of a sudden you're panicking, you need to go borrow somebody's frames. That'll give you a couple of days to be able to get some equipment if you don't have it.
Excellent idea. Very good. Now, I have one here. I think I mentioned it to you earlier where we have, the regular episodes we do on the podcast, but we also have the Bee Buzz where we kind of consolidate a whole lot of questions that come in via the Discord or email. So I saved this one for you today. This is one that came in. I think it was within the last 24 hours, but this will kind of give you an idea of some of the questions that we typically field here. So it says, newbie question. I have a very strong hive that started as a nuke this spring. With the recent hot weather, they've been bearding quite a bit, nothing out of the ordinary. Yesterday evening, they appeared to be doing the pre-swarm routine. Hundreds of bees were flying in circles outside of the hive and were pretty agitated. I've always heard this happens prior to a swarm and have seen this activity before they settled down into a proper swarm on a branch or something. This time they settled down about an hour later and never appeared to leave the hive. My grandfather's bees have done this several times this year, and after checking the next day, found they never left in a swarm. Any thoughts?
Well, first, have you checked the bottom of the frames in that hive to see if you have any swarm cells? That would be an indication. Even if you have a swarm cell, like it looks like a peanut, right, at the bottom of the frame or the bottom of wherever the foundation ends on a frame, check your peanut cells and see if there's royal jelly inside. If there's royal jelly in there, yep, they are planning on swarming. That's number one. The other thing is, with this weather the way it is, and if it's a very strong colony, the flights that you're seeing in front, if they're figure eights, those are brand new bees practicing to using their wings and learning how to fly. And that they're doing it here right now as well, because strong colonies have a lot of little bees eclosing, and with the temperatures that are been so record hot here, they do go out of the hive and they hang out on the front or the back of the hive to help regulate the temperature inside the hive. They want to keep it at 93 degrees, right? The brood chamber at 93 degrees. But when the temperatures get as hot as they are, they want to remove their little body heat, right, that they can generate to keep it cool. They're trying to keep it cool. You'll see a lot of water carriers running around bringing water back to the hive as well, because they use that to create air conditioning kind of conditions inside the hive. So if your bees are swarming, you can't miss that. Jeff, tell me if you think that's right. I mean, I've seen swarming, and it's like a little roar that starts up, and the bees are agitated, and you could swear that that they are taking numbers, right, to get ready. And you can see bees nudging other bees. You can see them because they are trying to get everybody kind of organized. Can't miss the little suitcases. I'm joking, but it is a very distinct sound. And when they start to swarm, it's a cloud that and with a roar that comes out of the hive, and they don't go very far because the new queen, they've just slimmed her down to be able to. If it's an initial swarm. If it's a virgin swarm, right, an after swarm, they could be tiny, tiny little cluster, and they may not have been able to get honey before they left. But I don't think you'll mistake a swarm once you see one.
Yeah, my gut when I first read through it, I thought, it sounds to me like maybe some new, nurse bees have been promoted. They've worked their way up through the ranks. They're going out for the first time, and they were, as the spring, everybody's being born. I mean, you got, maybe 1,000 new bees coming every day. So a bunch of them probably came of age around the same time, and they said, "Hey, it's a beautiful day. Let's all go out and do our orientation flights." That's kind of what was in my mind. And
yeah, that's what it sounds like to me too.
Yeah, another member had posted that, and it was funny because I said, "Well, I'm going to save this and I'll answer this. I'll have our interviewee answer." So he answered, then he goes, "Oh crap, I'm sorry, I didn't realize it." but it's always great to get different perspectives. So that's great.
Oh sure. Well, we did go on a swarm call once. It was 40 feet up in the tree, and it was a beekeeper. He wanted us to help us catch a swarm, and we violated every OSHA rule. Okay, he had his truck, and then a ladder on top of the truck, and a bucket of, an extension pole. It was a small miracle. Nobody was hurt. And he was trying to get the swarm out of the tree, and he aggravated them enough that they actually left the tree, flew down, and went back into the original hive.
Oh, wow.
We just stood there and we went, oh my, I didn't know they could do that, And I've also seen colonies that have swarmed and left and then followed by a second swarm. This year I had a swarm that we collected as the back of a police SWAT truck. It's like a little small tank. They had moved into the little turret area on top. It had 4 virgin queens in that swarm. So swarms can be in different configurations and for different reasons, but the description that your listener had, I think, is a pretty standard summer day, around a hive where the bees are enjoying the weather and they're trying to keep it cool, and they were not swarming.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. Now, you mentioned, so a few years ago, I had a swarm. It was a big, strong colony that I had. I just, I was very attached to them personally. I love them because they were so fierce and very gentle. Just, there were so many great things about this hive. And I think I had been traveling or something happened where I just didn't get that kind of first spring inspection done in time. And I pulled up in my truck and I look out and I just see them streaming out the front door. And I'm like, oh. So I've got a huge oak tree in my front yard, and I'm watching them go from the hive to the oak tree. And it's just... Oh,
it's trees.
Yeah, it was probably maybe 30 or 40 feet up, or I'm sorry, away from the colony, but then they were up in the tree a good, 50 feet. So there was no way I was getting to them, and I just thought, no, this is terrible. Here I'm losing these great bees, and there was a tropical storm or some kind of a storm system coming through, and it rained for 3 days straight. The cluster just sat there in the tree, and it just basically rained for 3 days straight. And I thought that I don't know what's going to happen. They can't scout. They can't do anything. And on day 4 that morning, beautiful sunny day, and just as you described, they streamed one by one right back into the original hive. And I was just shocked. And what I ended up doing is I put a regular, 10 frame deep, and I put it right under that spot. I put some swarm lure, swarm lure. I sprayed in there a little bit, and I left it. And then I ended up catching a swarm about 2 weeks later. I'm not sure if it was a different one or whatever, but I was thinking to myself, well, if I put this here, maybe they'll just go straight down. Well, they didn't. So I had never seen that before either. So you always learn something new. Yeah.
Well, have you heard of tanging? They call it tanging around here.
I don't think so.
The old beekeepers will talk about taking a pot and pan when you have a swarm and going out and beating with a spoon on the metal. And that supposedly will attract the bees back either into the original colony or into a hive. I've never done it. I never remember to do that when I have a swarm. But I always thought that was an interesting, story. It's lore that's been passed down in the beekeeping communities that's one way to get the swarms back. I will try it one day. I just never have a pot and pan when I'm trying to catch a swarm,
I will add that to my to-do list, so we'll have to try to figure that one out. That's neat.
Definitely, we'll compare notes.
So I'm down to, I think I've only got 2 more questions left here. So we're getting near the end, but, so this is a gal from our Discord room, very active in the room there up in Michigan. And she asked if there's any suggestions for those who are near commercial farmers, things to watch out for, preventative measures. Obviously certain pesticides and herbicides and things can affect the hives. My personal recommendation is, try to communicate with them early, often,
Absolutely.
Give them a couple of jars of honey every year and make sure, that they're friendly, but is there anything you can recommend outside of that?
Well, I think it's a nationwide network, the voluntary network called Bee Watch, and where you register your hive locations on a map so that the pesticide applicators know where there are colonies, and they can try to not spray them when the plants are in bloom, right? That's the critical part, is you don't want to have the bees exposed to pesticides when they're collecting the nectar and pollen. It's called Bee Watch. And the other thing is, talk to your extension offices because they're the ones that normally teach the EPA guidelines for private pesticide application, and make sure that they're telling the private applicators the correct information. Missouri, I happened to take the private pesticide applicator training here in February of 2019. I was just curious to see what they were teaching. And they were telling the applicators that bees only flew in the morning so they could spray in the afternoon. You could have killed me off the ceiling, okay? And so I ended up working with them, and now they have a brand new pesticide applicator training program that actually teaches pollinator protection steps. And so we've changed it. But you need to look at that, because it can be something very innocuous that somebody, doesn't know, and they think that they're giving the right information. So double check that and make sure that the extension offices that are doing the training are giving the correct information. And then for sure, if you can have a relationship with the applicators, by all means, a honey jar at Thanksgiving will go a long way to remind them that they need to be careful of what they're applying the next year. Same thing with farmers. They may not even think about it. But if you can develop a relationship with them, I think that's really good. I don't have a farm around me, but I'm in a small neighborhood. I'm the only house behind here. I have 7 neighbors, and every time they come in, the rest of the neighborhood tells them, go see the bee lady. I keep jars of honey, and I welcome to the neighborhood. And Thanksgiving Eve or Christmas Eve, depending on the weather, I walk the neighborhood and give them all a jar of honey to put on their Thanksgiving table or their Christmas table. And not every once in a while, somebody will say something about the bees, and I don't have to say a word, because the neighbors automatically jump in and say, oh, they're wonderful. I have better flowers. They don't cause any trouble. The kids love to go down and see them. I don't have to say a word, and so being a good neighbor as well. I don't point my hives up the hill, right? They're pointed down the hill. So if people are walking in the neighborhood, they don't run into bees. You just need to be a good neighbor. Consider how the bees might impact the people who are around you. And that includes farmers.
Well, I think you kind of had me at the key takeaway for me is I just need to be walking down your street around Thanksgiving time frame to get some free honey. That's what that was my key takeaway.
That's very true.
Well, it's funny because we usually extract in somewhere. I usually do it right around late June, just so that we have stuff on hand around 4th of July, because there's always people around, and you give a jar of honey for 4th of July. So it's usually like that mid to late June time frame. And inevitably, some of the girls, I have 3 daughters, so, the girls will be around, they have a couple of friends, and you send them home with a jar of honey. Every time you get that phone call, hey, can we buy some more of that? So
I know, it's true. It's true.
It's great for building relationships, and it's worth its weight in gold, so it's always fun.
Yeah. I've done it both ways. I do sell honey if I have a good year. I have a farmer's market, and I have a little a company that buys my honey. But I have to tell you, I have more fun giving it away.
Sure.
I have a tire company that does my maintenance on my car, and those 2 guys there love honey. And I've given them 2 jars, and I haven't paid for a service call and 3 visits. Well, I'm still working on the honey, So I love that.
There you go.
The idea of bartering, the idea of giving something of value that they obviously appreciate, and then they're returning the favor. There's something about that I love. That fact that we are recognizing that each one of us has something the other one wants, and then we're valuing that. I like that a lot.
100%. It goes right back to what you said earlier about not really knowing where our food comes from. Well, that's kind of where when you're interacting with those people and you're like, hey, I could really use a dozen eggs. Hey, I could really use some honey, and being able to work together, get to know people, and regardless of where you are in any kind of faith or anything, it has its own kind of fellowship to it. Just that interaction with others, and we. We're social creatures. We need that. So I think it's great on a lot of levels. Well, Charlotte, I've got one last question on the list here today. And it's a bit of a hot topic, pun intended, but you brought it up earlier, so it was on the list too.
Okay.
So one of the most common things I hear is, hey, I'm usually good for my first hive, but I cannot keep that smoker lit for anything beyond the first one.
Oh, that's a good one.
What do you recommend?
So one of the things you have to look, especially if you bought used equipment or used smokers, people tend to buy used smokers, is make sure that at the bottom of that smoker is that little dish, that little circle that has little legs, right? It's like a fireplace grate. You need to have that so that you can get oxygen through the smoker and whatever fuel you put in there. A lot of smokers get sold without that little plate that's at the bottom that has little legs. And when you empty your smoker out, sometimes you empty it out with all of your debris from your smoker and you forget to get it. And then all of a sudden you don't have one. You can make them I've made them out of wire, right, out of number 6, I think, hardware cloth, where I folded it up into a little square with the little prongs at the bottom. That's really important. It's probably the biggest issue that people have when they're trying to keep the smoker going. Secondly, smoker fuels, you don't want to use stuff that has chemicals in it. So some people say they use old jeans. I don't like those because you're burning chemicals that have been used to dye that fabric. I like cardboard, the cardboard that's not been treated. I use newspapers, the black and white, not the colored stuff. You go to a home and garden center, you can also get corn cobs. Corn cobs are wonderful. Mix up corn cobs with the litter that they use for rabbits in cages. It looks like shavings. That combination is a wonderful fire starter. I also use pine cones. I can find them here. Pine needles. The critical thing is to get that little fire kernel started. So I will take half of a pine cone and get the fire going in that little pine cone and then put it down. And then I will add little sticks. I have lots of sticks around here, dry tree sticks. And I will make a little teepee over that pine cone so that the sticks get going. And they're producing coal, right? They're becoming little charcoal. And then I will stuff it with pine needles. I love dried leaves. That makes the most wonderful cool smoke. And so you just keep puffing at it, right? You're trying to build up that bottom part of coals and then add your whatever fuel you want. The corn cob bedding mixture lasts a long time. And since I don't keep my smokers going for that long, I don't worry about having to have something go for a long time. But I make sure that I have coals at the bottom that are lifting off the bottom of the smoker. To test it, you want to put your smoker on your elbow, right, or the back of your knee to make sure it's cool smoke. You don't want hot smoke because you'll burn off your bee wings and their antenna. And if it happens to be hot, open your smoker up and put leaves, dried leaves, something that's going to take the heat of the smoke down. I've been known to just spray water and just get the fire down lower and then build it back up with something like dried leaves or I'm trying to think of, I've got cardboard, small pieces of cardboard. Yeah, you don't want a hot smoke. That's not good for your bees.
It's funny when people first ask the question to me, I just said, I walk in the yard and I just start looking around, but I tell people it's a mixture of the small and the big. You want the bigger stuff there to build those coals you were talking about, but you also need the smaller stuff to get it going. And it's always fun to see what people use. Like I have a sawmill and I have, because that was my whole thing. I was starting to look at the price of wood years ago, and I had a friend who's in the tree business, and I thought, well, he can get me free trees and I can start milling and I can make all my own hardware, so I won't have to spend $75 a hive to build or to buy one. So that was how that started. Well, now I've got this big pile of sawdust. I thought, well, this is going to be amazing. The problem with it is it's just a little bit too fine. So I do sprinkle a little bit in there with it. And of course it's got some pine in there too, so the pine sap can help a little bit. But if I put too much in, it almost smothers the fire.
Right. You just have to play with it. You'll find the combination that works for you. I have a lot of I have a shady garden, so I have a lot of twigs that come down and they're dry. It's not like I'll collect them. We just had some rain, so I'll go out and collect them, and I'll stick them in a bag, let them continue to dry out, and the next time I need a smoker going, I will pull those out, and they work well for me. I can get the little charcoal developed on those little twigs, and we're talking about maybe the size of a finger thickness, not really thick.
Yeah.
And I break them down into 2 to 3 inch lengths, and then build that little teepee, inside. And then I have my little container of dried leaves, because I have more than enough leaves, and that works for me. But I think for people, depending on you need to be careful about what you put in there, what you're burning. You don't want to be burning chemicals. You don't want to have it too hot, and you don't want to hurt yourself. Remember that thing is hot. And so learn to open it up and close it carefully. Watch the backside. You don't want fire shooting out, where you're adding oxygen to the fuel. And practice a couple times. You'll come up with the right combination for yourself. But it is tough. It is tough when you're starting.
Yeah, and I think if I remember correctly, as having not gone down this path yet, but I am here shortly. But I think that is part of, isn't it? Maybe the journeyman level, maybe, or one of the levels. I think lighting the smoker is a requirement, right?
My lips are sealed.
Oh, okay. I was hoping maybe I had an insider track here. Maybe I could get fast track. Maybe
divulge inside secrets. But you should know, right?
Yeah.
You should know. Just like you should know how to properly use the hive tool.
Absolutely.
When you start banging on top of the frames because the bees are proselytized that you are not using your hive tool correctly. Yeah. You should be able to use that hive tool quietly. The bees don't even know you're there. You're just gently moving, detaching that frame from the side of the box and moving it seamlessly. There should be no excitement going on when you're doing that. Well, and again, when you're beginning, it's hard, because you're excited, you're scared. The bees, you probably made some noise you didn't mean to make. You're going too fast because you want to seal that up. Take your time. To me, it's magical, my first couple inspections of the season, because the weather's perfect, 70 degrees, sunny, no wind. The flowers are blooming. I'm in my hive. The bees are happy. I think it's great. I love doing that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you nailed it earlier, right? When you first were talking about how you don't use a smoker and how you just go in, you take your time. I mean, I think that when you add the fear that you mentioned earlier and you combine that with how do I get out of a scary situation, that fight or flight mode, well, I run away. So the quickest, the best way to do that is to get it over with as fast as possible, which again is now completely opposite of what you need to be doing. And I've told people, hey, if you're going into the hive and you make a mistake, sometimes we've all pulled a frame out, you drop it, and it just causes chaos. Just close it back up. You can walk away. It's okay. You come back another time, but don't put that kind of pressure on yourself that you have to do everything within. I've told people, I'll do an inspection on a hive in 3 minutes, 4 minutes. Now, this is a scenario where I had, 50 or 100 of them I was inspecting in a day, and I'm looking for queen cells and I'm moving fast. So pop, look real quick, boom, go to the next one.
Right.
But as a hobbyist who's starting out, this should be something that is a relaxing, peaceful, enjoyable journey, just like you just mentioned, right? So take your time, and I think you nailed it.
They get to know you. I know this sounds crazy, but I can go through my apiary without a piece of equipment on and just look in front of the hives and check, under the cover, and my bees are not excited because I'm regularly out in them. And I also am not afraid of them, so I don't put out the fear pheromone.
Yes.
We have a pheromone when we are concerned with things. And so the bees themselves know. Matter of fact, this was funny. This was a January a couple of years ago. There was a plant sale. I'm terrible about plant sales. And so I had a bunch of plants in the back of my car, and all fall, a friend of mine was digging up her garden, and so I was bringing plants home in boxes and whatever, and the bees would always come and check out what was in the car. And so this particular January, I pulled up the car and I went in to go open the garage and turned around, and there were bees on my car waiting to see what was in the back of the. Now, here that they only have a 3-day memory or whatever. I hate to tell you this. I don't believe that, because there were bees waiting to check out my cache of plants. And I've also seen them in the garden. I'll be out there weeding or something, and all of a sudden there'll be bees coming around and, just kind of looking at what I'm doing. You can have a wonderful relationship with them that is not a negative experience. But you have to get your mindset around that they are not after you. This is a joint team approach. And I don't use the term aggressive. They're defensive. They're defending their home once they establish themselves. A swarm is not because they don't have a home. The other thing is that I always tell people that are starting, I'll say, enjoy your honeymoon in your first year, because the second year is totally different than your first year of beekeeping. And so when the beekeepers say, oh, well, I'm not wearing equipment because the bees are, they were very mild and they weren't, I always say, always wear your hood. Yes. You don't always have to have gloves, but make sure you have your hood on. Because to a bee, our nose openings and our mouth looks like a black threat, which is why they go after stinging our nose and sometimes our eyes, because they don't see as well as we do. But this is a threat to them. So make sure you have your veil on. And if you can get comfortable managing your bees or handling your bees without gloves, that's great, because they will tell you when you make a mistake. And you will be forced to go slower. I prefer doing it without gloves. It took me a while to get there. And I think the fact that I'm not afraid of them, I can go work other bees. I can't remember the last time I had gloves on. And I'm not boasting here. I'm just saying to you, you can get your mindset to a point where you understand the risk you're taking, right? You might get stung. You understand what the bees are doing. And you're making choices that are in both of your best interests, in the best interest of your bees and in your best interest. And it usually ends up with nobody getting stung.
I think I was probably, I'm guessing here, but maybe 5 or 6 years in, and it just hadn't even crossed my mind about even the idea that I wouldn't wear gloves. I saw some people doing it in videos, and I thought, well, they're doing it because they're crazy, right? Well, then I started really doing more research and learning about it. And I think it might have been Michael Palmer that was talking about it, and he was like, well, yeah, I have better dexterity, and I can feel
right.
if I grab a bee with my finger and I squeeze, I can feel it squirming, and I can lift my hand up, but you lose all of that dexterity with the gloves on. So I think it was, it was about 6 years ago. I thought, all right, well, let me just leave one on, and then I'll put the nitrile glove on the other hand. So I kind of eased my way in. Well, then
that's a nice idea. Yeah.
So I realized, well, the nitrile, on the one hand, I didn't get stung. So I think that when I moved on the next time, I just did 2 of the nitrile gloves, and nothing happened. And I did that probably maybe one more time, and then I thought, they're not messing with me. And then once I went completely gloveless, it was a whole new world to me. I mean, yes, like you said, you're going to catch a sting here and there, but you scrape the stinger off, hit a couple puffs of smoke, and you go right back to it.
Right. And the other thing is, when you're starting, there's a tendency to not fit the gloves. We see this all the time here. So you want the suit a little bigger, but your gloves need to fit. So if you're going to buy a pair of gloves, make sure you go somewhere where you can try them on, because the sizing is completely off. I have wide hands, but I wear an XX small in a beekeeping glove. And that means I have no extra inch, at the tip of my fingers. And it actually, like a nitrile glove, it fits me. And that's what you want. When you're using gloves where you have so much room that you can barely hold the frame and you're squishing bees left and right, you are not going to have a good experience. I can guarantee that.
Absolutely.
So spend the time finding the right gloves for yourself. You know, you can go to your club and ask people who have the beekeeping equipment, ask them to bring in their gloves for you to try on.
That's
when
a really
we have
good
our
idea.
Class, yeah, we just have all the we have 4 or 5 beekeepers bring in their suits. Some people have the long suits. I've only owned the jacket and their gloves. And we'll say, go try them on. Find where those gloves were purchased. Most people know. And get the glove that fits you. And then go order those, And that has really saved a lot of people having the bad experience, because at that stage in your beekeeping, you name your bees, right? Frank, Harold, Joey, you're so conscious of what you're doing to your bees that every time you squish one, it's devastating. And so that makes the experience a bad experience for some people who are starting. So if you can minimize that, and yes, we all know some bees will die out of this, but, you shouldn't do it because you don't have the right equipment on.
No, that's an absolutely great suggestion. I was thinking to a few years ago where it must have been probably around that time I was making the transition. I couldn't find my gloves and I needed some. I think I was doing a big move and I thought I've got to track down some gloves. And I couldn't find mine, and I found my daughter's, and I was like, well, I got to make use of what I've got here. And it turned out, I think hers were a medium. I have pretty good sized hands, but hers were a medium. But I put them on, and they actually were better because my fingers completely filled the entire glove, and they were tight and snug. And I thought, well, that's interesting. If I ever buy new ones, I'm going to buy one size smaller. So that was a good little opportunity to learn something.
That's a good tip. Well, our moms always teach us when we buy shoes, right? We buy it with 1 inch extra space of the toes. And I think some of the beekeepers I've spoken with over the years use that same philosophy. Is if you have more glove, you won't get stung, right? There's more room for your fingers to kind of, hide from the bees. And it's like, no, that's not the right way to think about this. You need to think about your ability to gently and slowly handle the equipment. And yes, there's always a chance you'll get stung. But in most cases, again, if the bees are happy, they're not out there wanting to sting. I mean, obviously, they know if they sting, they die, right? So they have to be threatened enough that they're willing to give their life to protect the colony. And so that's got to be a bit of a threat. They've got to choose to make that decision and then leave the pheromone for other bees to attack. And I've never seen that. I mean, I've had people tell me that their bees chase them around the yard, and I've never had that experience. And I said, well, what did you do? Well, these are aggressive bees. No, something was not quite right with the colony. They just would not go out to do that as a lark. There's something is not right. And so the challenge there is just to start backing up and trying to figure out what it is instead of blaming, the colony. And I've heard people say you have to requeen. In most cases, in my experience, it's a space issue. It's not about the queen. For example, in August, this coming up, I've had people say to me, well, the queen's not laying. I don't see any eggs. Well, if it's hot like it is now, and there's nothing in nature, guess what? The bees are eating the eggs. They're getting the protein from the queen's eggs. And so the queen may still be laying, but they're disappearing because the bees need the sustenance that they can't get in nature. You have to be careful about making assumptions that the queen's not laying, so ergo you have to replace her. She may very well be laying, but there are other factors that are influencing her success.
I wish I could have like flashing lights and asterisks all around what you just said, because I remember those first few years where I thought, oh no, something's wrong with my queen. And I would go through the colony around this time of year and I'm looking at every frame and there's no eggs anywhere. And I'm just thinking, I can't find the queen. She's gone. And it happened to me. It happened to one of my neighbors. we just thought that we're just really bad beekeepers, and the reality is that they're not going to make new brood if there's no food, there's no brood, and
that's right.
But it's funny, as a new beekeeper, I had no idea, and that's the whole reason that I kind of started this journey about what I'm doing, because there's, getting the information out there to other people so that they know, hey, there's a lot of moving parts here and things you want to consider. So that was another great point. Charlotte, I truly appreciated your time today. It's been a wonderful discussion. I mean, I think we could probably go for another 2 hours, because there's just so much great information, and I really enjoyed talking to you. Is there anything that you wanted to get out, or any message in particular that you wanted to share with the listening audience around the world here?
Well, I know there are people who think about getting into beekeeping, and for whatever reason, it's not for them. Maybe they invest in it and they decide they don't want to do it, or they take a class and they don't want to do it, and that's perfectly fine. You can have native bees that only are around for 3 months or so. Different parts of the world, they have different native bees, but you can find a native bee house and house those bees. And if you don't want to mess with them, plant more flowers. Get the grass, the turf grass that you have on your front lawn. Slowly move your flower beds out so you have less and less grass, and plant more flowers. They need foraging. They need food sources. That continues to dry up on them worldwide, and we just need to be adding that so they have a place to go and get food and be healthy.
That's a great point. I'm that person that I kind of get in trouble. We have an ordinance within the city where, if your grass is more than a foot high, they can cite you and give you a hard time about it. And I despise mowing in the spring, because I have all these beautiful natural flowers that come up in my yard, and I wait till the very end, and I haven't been cited yet, because I've got a nice Leyland cypress line of defense against the city now. But it's just, I just love leaving them like they are. I wish I could just let it grow and have all the native wildflowers there, but at some point I have to conform. So,
well, you work with your city government, though. There are more municipalities who are aware of the plight of pollinators and are willing to work on that. You can have native gardens now in some larger metropolitan areas, because local beekeepers and master gardeners have worked with them. So, if you have a representative where you live, go talk to them. What are the chances are that we can get this changed so that we can have more pollinator habitat? And you might be surprised at how receptive they might be.
That's a really good idea. And like I said, I think it's about 200 Leyland cypress that are kind of all around the front. So there's only the driveway, where you can see through.
I see. Right.
So I might be able to work that out. So I will, I'll add that to my to-do list and see if I can get those folks on board a little bit.
Yep, well, let me know how it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do owe you a follow-up email. I will get you an email for those for the requesting the recipe, and then those inner covers I was telling you about. But Charlotte, again, thank you so very much for your time. And if you ever have any messaging you need to get out to anybody, or if you'd like to come back on again and talk to us again, feel free to let me know. And if you have any follow-on messages you'd like me to post in the Discord, or if you'd like to be invited to the Discord, we can send you an invite there. You're always happy to come and join us and chat and share your knowledge with us.
Well, thank you very much. It's always fun to talk bees. And you're right, we probably could go on and on. And I want to wish everybody who's here, good luck. And remember, it's not a black and white situation. So the best thing you can do is have people like Jeff who are willing to help you and give you a forum to ask your questions. Ask your questions, post your pictures. I think the beekeeping community in general is a very kind and supportive community. So you're not there by yourself.
I would agree. Very well said. Well, again, Charlotte, thank you so very much for your time. Have a great holiday weekend, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk to you again sometime soon.
Look forward to it, Jeff. Take care.
Okay, take
Bye,
care. We'll
everybody.
See you. Bye-bye. Well, everybody, that wraps up our time with Charlotte. Again, Charlotte, thank you so very much for being on the podcast with us. That was just a whole lot of fun. Really, really great time. Sorry to hear about all the heat and the crazy weather you've had out there in the Midwest. Glad to see that you did get a little bit of rain to hopefully cool some things off. But again, I cannot thank you enough. It was an absolute pleasure having you on the show. So ladies and gentlemen, as always, feel free to reach out, Jeff at beekeepingfornewbies.com. If you'd like to join us in the Discord room, just go to Beekeeping for Newbies. That's NEWBEES.com. About halfway down on the left-hand side, there is a link to the Discord server. Got about 135 people or so in there. Love to have you join in with us and engage in some conversation, have some fun. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to listen, and we'll see you next week.